Hi there, Kobo in Conversation listeners. I'm Nathan Maharaj, producer of the show, and the host of this episode. I'm coming in here to let you know we recorded this conversation a couple months ago when this novel, Lake Burntshore, first came out, and we've been planning all along to release it at the start of summer camp season. So we're going ahead with that now, but if you need the absolute bare minimum of content regarding conflict in the Middle East in your feed right now, then this might be an episode to skip. It's up to you. We just wanted you to know. All right, here's the episode.
You can live these two different lives, your home life with your parents and school and the city, etc. And then camp, where you're all living together. The rules are completely different. It's much, much more communal. The fact that you can live those two separate lives means that different worlds are possible. It means that we have a say in how we build the society we live in.
I'm Nathan Maharaj, and this is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is the poet and novelist Aaron Kreuter. His new book is Lake Burntshore, the story of a Canadian Jewish summer camp that's just hired a handful of young Israeli soldiers after having to fire a few camp counselors over some bad choices. Aaron Kreuter, welcome to Kobo.
Thanks for having me, Nathan.
Why write a book about summer camp?
That's the question on everybody's mind, isn't it?
That's the one that presented itself most obviously based on that introduction.
I went to Jewish summer camp as a kid, and I was in love with it, as a lot of the characters are in the novel. Since I was 16, before I even was a writer, I wanted to write a novel that took place at summer camp, and about 20 years later, I finally sat down to do it.
That's incredible. So the poetry, the other books, all of that writing was that was a warm up to realize your lifelong dream of writing this book.
In some ways, that's definitely true. Yeah, a lot of the themes I explored in my poetry and short fiction books sort of come together in the geography of this fictional summer camp.
What was it that you wanted to capture about camp that you've wanted to do since before you were even a writer?
Jewish summer camp is a true North American phenomenon. There's quite literally hundreds of them across North America. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish youth go to them and becomes a major part of their identity. There's of course summer camps that aren't catered towards Jewish kids, but it's a major aspect of the Jewish North American experience. And sleepover camp is this strange place where you leave your parents, you leave your school life, and you go and you live in a cabin with your friends and your enemies, people your own age, and it's a totally different type of world, very close-knit. Everything is geographically bounded. You know everyone. You eat in a huge dining room together. Just that difference from our regular North American lives really, really was compelling to me, and still is.
The main character of this book is Ruby. She's someone we're with the whole way through, and we get inside her mind a little bit. She knows the camp well. It's a part of her, but now she's got some responsibility here. That's where we join her. Tell me about Ruby.
Yes, Ruby is a young woman. She's 21 in the novel, so she's been staff at Camp Burntshore for about 5 years, and she really, really, truly loves camp. Sort of in her non-camp life, she's a university student at York University, and she's a committed anti-Zionist activist. She's very involved in campus politics, and she's very much looking forward to taking this time off from her sort of political life, what they call in the novel the big wide, right, which is the world outside of camp. And unfortunately or fortunately, this particular summer, 2013, Ruby's unable to get away from the political, or in another way, the political finds her at this camp.
And where are we set? Because I think some folks hear this and they think, "Oh my God, this is this is a powder keg. How could this sounds like the most uncomfortable summer ever?" But this is not set now. It's at another time.
Yes, the novel is set in 2013, so it's definitely set before October 7th and the events afterwards, which I think is what you're referring to. But, importantly, these issues and these tensions, both within the Jewish community and in the world at large, are still very much prevalent. That's one thing that I think the novel has to say today, right, that these issues in the Jewish community, allegiance to Israel or Zionism writ large, were still very much active in 2013 as Ruby and the events of the novel show.
Yeah. Why 2013? I mean, I imagine it's contemporary enough that it feels nowish, but it's also not so far back that we expect these kids to grow up. But it's also contemporary enough. I think it was probably like the cusp of when a kid would be expected to have a smartphone. Maybe like this was the last summer where that would not be requisite.
That's obviously an important part of it. The camp itself has, a no cell phone policy, but Ruby herself does have a phone and she does use it. 2013, it's 12 years ago. I'm not exactly sure what the cutoff is for when something becomes historical fiction or not, A lot has changed since then. One of the main reasons it was set in 2013 is because that was the major summer of Idle No More, when a major summer of Indigenous resistance in Canada, mm-hmm. which, ends up playing an important role in the novel.
Mm-hmm. Ruby exchanges letters with a friend back in Toronto named Seema. We read a couple of Seema's letters, so we get a sense of the friendship and the tone of it and the material of it all. Seema is Palestinian, and it seems like a lot of Ruby's political views are bound up in a genuine love and a loyalty with her friend. And as you say, like, she didn't get to escape politics this summer. It didn't turn out to be the break she was hoping it would be. Ruby's kind of the way in for the reader, because I think, we pick up a novel and we're not all looking to engage with the hottest issues of the day. Often we're looking for escape, but we are kind of like Ruby where we're kind of landing in it. Can you tell me about setting that up, calibrating kind of the temperature of that and bringing the reader in through this character?
That's a great question, Nathan. Yeah, I knew that Ruby was going to be the protagonist of the story, and I knew it was going to be set at a Jewish summer camp, which already, is not only, bounded geographically. It's a very, small space on this lake, which is the title of the book, Lake Burntshore. But it's, it's bounded, ethnically, right? Like the majority of people at the camp are Jewish, not all of them. And I wanted to have in the narrative a Palestinian presence, a Palestinian, a character that can embody, or a character that lives the Palestinian narrative. And Ruby having a best friend who's also her pen pal during the summer, and they're exchanging letters, came to me as a very neat way of sort of having Seema's presence in the novel, Ruby's best friend, and also having sort of this judgment of what's going on in the novel coming in from outside. And that, as you mentioned, we don't actually see Ruby's letters. We see Seema's letters. We see Seema responding to what Ruby's telling her about what's going on this summer at camp. And only at the very end do we actually see Ruby's letter to Seema. And Ruby sort of apologizing for some things she said to Seema earlier in the novel. For Ruby's politics aren't just, aren't just these huge things. They're very much lived, right? She had, her best friend is Palestinian. She sees things from Seema's point of view. So it's not just inter-Jewish tensions. And that also comes up through the Anishinaabe characters in the novel as well. Because next to the camp, there's an Anishinaabe reserve, the Black Spruce First Nations, and there's some major Anishinaabe characters in the novel. Yeah, the Anishinaabe community that's nearby is really intimately bound up with Camp Burntshore. They very much, the word neighborhood doesn't feel like it applies because it's a lake and it's very outdoorsy, but it does feel like a neighborhood. It feels like a relationship between neighbors. I assume that Indigenous community was always going to be there as you planned this novel, that was a point of tension you wanted. Was it something you were aware of maybe when you were a kid at your Jewish summer camp? I was definitely not aware of the Indigenous presence on the land when I was a teenager, definitely not to the level I am now.
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of the settler colonial history of the land as a teenager. I think things are very much different now. I think a 16-year-old living in Toronto, say, is going to be much more cognizant of that history. We live in a post-truth and reconciliation report world, after all.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, when I was 16, I did not know this was going to be a part of the novel. The way the Anishinaabe presence in the novel came to me is actually a really interesting story. Back when I was first starting the novel, almost maybe 6 or 7 years ago, and I was reading a lot, I was researching a lot. There's actually a lot of sort of academic books about Jewish summer camp. I was talking to my friends and my family members, collecting camp stories, and my younger sister mentioned that at her camp that she went to, natives worked in the kitchen, and right away that just blossomed into this into the idea that we basically see here, right? That you can actually represent sort of the settler colonial history of Canada, of Ontario, of the Anishinaabe lands by putting them in the same neighborhood, as you say. I've been using the word geography, but neighbor or land, but neighbor is also a really good word. As it turns out, my sister didn't actually mean indigenous people when she used the word native. She meant more like locals, like townies.
But the seed was planted.
Yeah, exactly. The seed was planted. And so once the Anishinaabe presence was in the novel, Cindy is the head chef at Camp Burntshore, and she's sort of a big, joyful presence in the novel, and everybody loves her. And then Jeff is the other major Anishinaabe character, a university student, and is friends with Ruby, and is a very gifted musician, writer, painter. And he's sort of deciding what he wants to do with his life, as a lot of us do in college. And him and Ruby have some really deep, heartfelt conversations about the Jewish history, indigenous history, Canadian history, settler history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, reading about that adjacency, that neighborhood, I was reminded of when my own family went camping at a provincial park that we go to a lot, almost every year. And one year the main entrance was blocked by a protester. It was an indigenous man who was protesting a variety of things. I think fundamentally it came down to, like, it's a provincial park and this land is covered by a treaty that says it should probably be used differently. I'm not a lawyer, but I think there's ample precedent for that kind of thing. It did spark a conversation I had with my kids about treaties, about the land back movement, about this at the time it was actually probably the year after or a year or two after Idle No More, so it was something we were thinking about. It occurred to me, though, talking about stuff like that, talking about claims on land, is easier to do when we're talking about a summer camp, when we're talking about where we spend our vacation. It's a lot easier to do than when we're talking about our mailing address. Was that a natural device that showed up and you realized, oh, this is fun, I can now play here? Or was that a more deliberate thing to think, I want to have this conversation, but the reader's going to just the anxiety will get too high if we're talking about, people being evicted from their mailing address?
I never really thought of the question in terms of this being sort of cottage country, right, in quotations, versus the city. It's a really, really interesting way to frame it. To my mind, what we call cottage country throughout Canada and throughout America, it's much more the frontier than the city. That's where you can see these mechanisms of settler colonialism much more visibly, right? That's where the reservations are. That's where there's often a higher indigenous presence. That's where the fight over mining rights and logging rights, etc., plays out. So I was looking at it very much in that way. In the second half of the novel, when Brett, who's the camp owner's son, is attempting to buy this 10,000 acres of crown land around the lake, and Ruby and Itai and other characters in the novel are attempting to stop Brett from doing that. It becomes very, very much about the land, right? Mm-hmm. About who has the right to the land, about the settler colonial history in so-called Canada, and because of the other major things happening in the novel, the arrival of the Israeli soldiers, the sort of the battle for for what kind of camp Camp Burntshore is going to be. The novel really sort of juxtaposes, settler colonialism here and settler colonialism in Palestine. This it's not the same thing as we're going to, as our mailing address, our home address, as you say. But to the people in the novel, the people who live at camp, it is home. Yeah. It is a kind of home, right? It's their home away from home. They wait all year to be there, so there is a connection to the land there. Yeah,
and certainly there's stakes there. Like the emotional tie for the campers is there, but they're kids, so it's different. We should talk about these soldiers, because it's a fascinating twist that comes very early in the book. We've not spoiled anything, dear listener. Like, please understand, this is the inciting action we're talking about. We're not talking about the major reveal. A bunch of camp counselors, as I said in the intro, they made some bad decisions. They contravened some rules. And Tom, the camp director, the owner, he takes decisive action and creates a problem for himself, because he's got this labor shortage. And then out of nowhere, like I say, these young, apparently gorgeous Israeli enlisted soldiers get flown in. First thing I've got to ask is, where did you get that detail from? Is that a thing? Like, if I need a synagogue painted, is there a list I'd apply to and I can possibly get somebody for the summer?
I don't know about that, but if you ran a Jewish summer camp and you wanted to bring some Israeli soldiers in, you definitely
it really
could.
Is a thing.
Yes. In my own camping resume, I went to a bunch of different camps. One of them had Israeli soldiers as staff. They're called shlichim, which sort of, I think, translates as ambassadors. So Jewish summer camp world, they exist on a spectrum. There's incredibly secular ones. There's more religious ones. There's more what we call progressive ones. There's more Zionist ones. The Zionist summer camps, for decades, have had Israeli soldiers come as staff. So it's a real thing that happens. And so what's being explored in the novel is what would happen if sort of Camp Burntshore is a very secular camp. Like, religion really isn't a part of it, but the vast majority of kids and campers and staff are Jewish. Is what happens if sort of this more Zionist type of camp, if they hit each other. And it's Tom's son Brett whose idea it is to bring in these soldiers, right? Brett's idea of Jewishness is much more connected to Zionism and the land of Israel, and he wants to bring these soldiers in.
Yes. And these soldiers, they are distinct characters. We just keep saying these soldiers, but you've mentioned Itai. There are others. They're unique characters. Each one is kind of their own thing. Itai stands out because he and Ruby get romantically entangled. It begins with sort of a fellow traveler kind of recognition politically, and then it becomes a white hot romance through the summer. It is, and it's pretty hot stuff. This is all I'm going to say, folks. I'm just some great page turning scenes. Most of these soldiers, though, they seem like they don't. I mean, when we talk about soldiers, they're young adults. They're young adults who are doing. I think my read of them is I think they're young adults mostly doing what the grown-ups expect them to do. The grown-ups back in Israel expect them to do. Now they're here, and there's other grown-ups expecting them to do other stuff. Was that? Is that? Does that feel like how you meant to get them across?
I think that's an excellent reading of the soldiers. There's 5 of them, and as you mentioned, Nathan, they're all individual, fully fleshed out characters, right? Who have their own politics and baggage. But yes, I mean, Israel has mandatory army service, except for the extremely religious, and it's a very much that militarism. Sort of machismo is very much built into Israeli society. Itai, who Ruby ends up starting a relationship with, sort of almost against her politics at the beginning. Itai himself is a conscientious objector. He enlisted in the army, but he refused to serve in the occupied territories and has actually served time in Israeli military prison, which does happen. And so that's sort of what drew Ruby to him in the beginning. When Ruby and Itai first meet, and Ruby says, "I highly doubt the Israeli army sent a conscientious objector to come to the summer camp to represent Israel," Itai says, he leans in and he says in like a very, secretive, sort of seductive voice, it was a clerical error. So
I love that detail.
For sure. I think it's a great detail too, and it sort of builds the character. And also, I did need a mechanism to have Itai come, right?
Right.
And so it works out in that way. And, Itai and Ruby start this romance. That they also have very hot, to use your word, fights, and they help each other grow and see what's going on, right? When Itai says to Ruby, this summer camp is not much different than parts of Palestine, right? Where it's like the land is being settled. This is a big realization for Ruby that she sort of doesn't want to accept at first.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because it's a place she loves. It's the idea that she has a clarity of youth. This is bad. This is good. And she's just been introduced to the concept that underneath the foundation of this thing that you see as an essential good, some pretty bad stuff. The stuff that you recognize as unequivocally bad. It's awfully upsetting for her.
And Ruby, being a college student, maybe being a burgeoning, intellectual herself, what does she do? She decides to do some research on the history of Ontario, on the history of the treaties, on the history of the Crown Land, which we get as readers sort of filter through Ruby's perspective. And then, on top of that, this Brett's plan to buy all this Crown Land around the lake really sort of focuses everything in on land and our relationship to land.
Yeah.
In some ways, the novel explores through these characters and these situations and these conflicts, different relationships to land, right? Diasporic, settler, indigenous. It puts them in contention all on this geography around the lake.
We've been talking a lot about these points of tension, and this book has many subtly drawn points of tension. Like as we say, the soldiers don't all align politically, personally. They even think some of the most fervently pro-Israel folks at the camp are kind of silly because, like, what do you know about Israel? Like, might as well be Tatooine for all you know. It's a thing you're a big fan of, but it's not a place because you haven't been there. And that they see it as silly to be feeling that strongly. So there are these lovely tensions, these things where people, the lines don't get drawn clearly between parties. What I thought was really interesting, though, is how the novel keeps moving forward because the battle lines don't get drawn. There aren't clear schisms, and it feels like the camp has this culture of debate and disagreement that people can say screw you, but they're still in line to get the bannock that Cindy's serving that night because that's the snack for this evening. Talk to me about that culture. Is that something recognizable to you as real, or is that an ideal? Is that an aspirational thing?
That's an absolutely fantastic read of the novel. I don't know if I was consciously aware of that per se, but it definitely speaks to what I know of the Jewish experience, of the Jewish diaspora, right? There's this joke in the Jewish community, 3 Jews, 3 opinions, right? And I think that that really is what's playing out here, right? Is that Burntshore is a community, and though there are real intense tensions and conflict in the summer, this community on the lake sort of moves through it. I really appreciated when you pointed out how Dov, who's the most sort of Zionist of the Israeli soldiers, he's sort of the most, he sees himself very tough. And how he views these campers' obsessions with the soldiers, because a lot of the campers are obsessed.
They
right?
are obsessed,
and that's a true phenomenon too. But these are the differences between sort of the diasporic Jewish experience, especially when it comes to Israel, and Israelis themselves. We see it playing out in the news every day, where some Jewish people living in North America are much more fervent and black and white in their thinking versus Israelis. So this is a phenomenon that we see, right? It's not just the Canadian Jewish people who have disagreements.
Yeah.
It's the macro as well.
That joke, I've heard it told 3 Jewish people, at least 3 opinions. One can disagree with oneself.
Definitely, for sure.
And that is something I admire.
And Ruby doubts herself throughout the book as well, right? I think doubt's a really important part about having convictions.
Yeah.
Right? Because someone who believes something so strongly that they never reflect or ask themselves, why do I think this? That leads to, arrogance and sort of hard-heartedness.
Yeah, it's a precious thing Ruby's going through, is that questioning, because reading it, going along that journey with her, I think what we want, or at least what I wanted for her, was to keep going. I know it's tiring and I know it's hard, but please come out the other side of this not seeking stasis and comfort, but that more mature thing, I think, where you realize, oh yeah, there are no good guys and there are no bad guys. There's bad things, there's hurtful things, but the people, the individual, it's a mess. It's all a mess, and it's never going to get easy. It's always going to be hard.
Yeah, I think Ruby is a character who is willing to put in the work.
Yeah,
and I think that's something we could all probably take from Ruby. Yeah, for sure. The novel, in some ways, wants to show the humanness of these sort of major structural inequalities and oppression and things. But in some ways, people are still responsible for their actions.
I think Brett is bad. I think Brett is bad. It's funny for me to say that, because as I was crafting this thought that I wanted to ask you about, I was like, yeah, there's no good guys and bad guys. Even there's aspects of Dove that's just he's still very young, and I still want to I want to bear that in mind, how young he is, how much growing he has to do. But Brett makes some deliberate actions that are entirely voluntary. He has set his sights on this land, and has you wonder, how does he show up in the mess hall to get a snack with indigenous staff there and not see what he's about to do? And it's not even a conversation. It's just his little scheme. Yeah, he's bad. I guess I wanted to get that on the table. There are bad guys. There are bad things you can do, and it's when you seek to cause harm and you know it's going to be harm and you decide to blind yourself to it. Yeah, he's a bad guy. But I guess I want to ask you then about this character Brett, because he does stand out in his malevolence, and that's a strong flavor in a book with a lot of seasoning, to extend the metaphor.
Brett is definitely a strong flavor. Yes. For sure. I know people like Brett. I know people who've been so consumed by their ideology and politics that it's just the way they see the world, right? Brett very much embodies the settler colonial mindset. It's not a coincidence when Ruby tries to insult Brett by calling her Duddy Kravitz, alluding to the iconic Mordecai Richler novel, Duddy Kravitz Was Here, where Duddy basically becomes obsessed in 1950s Montreal with making enough money to buy all this land around a lake in Quebec, is that Ruby correctly sees it as that same sort of settler urge, right? That becomes obsessive, right? And we see it in the history of Canada. We see it in the history of all settler colonial states. And Brent does try to sort of explain himself, or he does justify his actions at certain points. The novel has sort of a loose third-person narrator, right? And we go into people's heads. We don't just see Brett through Ruby's eyes. We actually go into Brett's head for brief periods, and we see what he's thinking.
It's not a great place to be.
We also go into the characters' heads of some of the Anishinaabe characters. The narrator really is able to move around, which I think adds to this sense of community that you were talking about, right? The human messiness of all of us living together in this one place.
There's a tradition of using indigenous iconography in summer camps, and this is not a Jewish summer camp thing. This is a summer camp writ large thing, and I should actually correct that. It's not indigenous iconography. It's more it's indigenish, like it's play acting phony indigenous stuff. It's offensive. Though in this book, that stuff is largely in the past. We get a brief note that at some point Cindy was like, hey man, don't call that activity what you're calling it, because it's kind of gross. And Tom's like, okay, you're right. And they change it. And it's not a big thing, which itself is a lesson we can all take. It's not hard. But there's also there are, as you said, as secular a camp as this is, there are lovely Jewish traditions that are brought here, and they are genuine. And it's this delicate balance because they're beautiful. And Ruby, being very secular, is like, I'm not really up for it, but also like it actually is really nice. Like the Friday night's really nice. It just is. Talk to me about that balance, because it does feel like a constant thing that Tom's having to figure out as a guy who's in charge, and that the whole camp is kind of always wrestling with.
That's a great way to phrase it. Yeah, and as we learn in the novel, Tom's father, who started the camp, there was more of a religious aspect to it, but Tom turned the dial down on that. Yeah. Though the Friday night dinner is still sort of a big deal, which, the most secular of Jews, even if they don't mark Friday in any way, it's still Friday.
It's still Friday. It's still special.
The 7-day calendar is that Jewish calendar, right? So it's right at the heart of the culture, really. And then for Brett, turning that dial up means one thing: means being more Zionist, means being more connected to Israel. And for Ruby, her Jewishness ties into an entirely different tradition in history, a tradition of social progress and progressive politics, socialist politics. And I really did want to put all those things together, right? In some ways, this novel is challenging this idea that there's one Jewish narrative, and it's the narrative of Israel. And in terms of summer camps and indigeneity, yes, for sure. I mean, the entire summer camp movement and phenomenon was very much based on mimicking, indigeneity across North America. I think in general, the Jewish summer camp experience was a bit removed from that, but that's probably not true at all camps. But yes, you mentioned that when Cindy became the head chef, she sort of brought her perspective to the camp, and she had Tom change the name of two things: the sort of the relay race and the big color war day, which was called the Apache, which it probably is called that.
Probably
hundreds of camps. Yep. In writing this novel, I wondered, why is it called the Apache, and I looked it up, and the Apache peoples actually did have sort of this sacred, I don't know if relay race is the right word, event. So it was taken from this real people, right? And also Cindy has them change the name of the buffalo hunt, which is when the whole camp does garbage pickup. So
when they do the cleanup, which is just that's astonishing. Yes.
So camp is this place where people come in and they bring themselves and their presence and their perspective, and the camp is able to adjust or not. At the beginning of the novel, when the Israeli soldiers arrive, Ruby is freaked out that it's going to change the tenor of camp forever. That's sort of the first major crisis in the novel.
The fakeness, the fake culture. What it reminded me of was Katharina Vermet's latest book, Real Ones, where one of the observations made by one of the characters is that a tragic aspect of cultural appropriation is not just the theft, but it's also the displacement. That you're taking on this fake culture and papering it over a real one. Therefore, you're offending people today by stealing their culture, and you're offending your ancestors by just kind of erasing them. It does raise the question in this book of what is authentic, and what do we owe our ancestors? What do we owe ourselves? Yeah, and it certainly doesn't answer it. So this is a terrible question to ask, because it's an irresolvable question.
I might not answer, but I do think the novel maybe gestures towards something. Ruby is very much throughout the novel. Ruby is trying to find a way to live well and to live true to herself and her people without stealing, without appropriating. And one way I think Ruby does this is through this idea of diaspora, right? There's this radical stream of diaspora thought where, diaspora means you live in a place, you don't have ownership of land, you don't have borders, you don't oppress other people, you live there without temporal or land-based power, and you allow, and other people live around you too. And I think it gets presented as an alternative to violent nation states. And so that all is happening on the lake as well too, right? All these as I mentioned earlier, all these different ways to live with and on the land. Without giving anything away, by the end of the novel, Ruby begins to see the possibility of how to live on this land, this this Anishinaabe land in Ontario, in Canada, more as a guest, right? More to be more respectful of the treaties. The novel gestures towards this way through this sort of settler colonial impasse, or I hope it does.
Later in the book, there's a chapter where staffers they're playing a game of inventing stories from a name, and this seems like a familiar game. Like, this is the one they're kind of poking fun at their own history and culture, and it's cute, and it's pretty amusing. But that chapter ends with 3 brief biographies, and they're italicized, and they stand out. And the names are Moshe Zimmerman, Asaf Zadovolsky, and Leonard Brown. And it feels like we're taking a step out of the book when those names and their brief biographies happen. Can you tell me, where are we stepping into when we read those names and their stories?
I think the way that chapter is structured, yes, we've sort of taken a step back from this sort of biography game, if we can call it that, right? Which starts when they find this book that the one of the visiting doctors, Dr. Farberman, has this library. He's also a very firm believer in Israel, and it's a very sort of Zionist tinted library. There's some fun and excitement around the book, around his library as well. He has a book which is about the Canadian Jewish connection and relationship to Israel. That's actually a very real book, and they're looking at the names of Canadian Jewish men, mostly who went to Israel in '48 to, depending on your perspective, fight in the War of Independence or participate in the Nakba. And that's sort of where this game starts of making up names. And so at the end of the chapter, it does sort of zoom out, and there's these 3 names, and it just continues. It ties the game into history, I think, in a way, right? This is Israel was established in 1948. Jewish people from all over the world came to participate in it, and so what do we do now? What do these characters do now who are trying to, find their way through this current Jewish situation?
Mm-hmm. At the halfway mark of the book, there's an event that happens apparently halfway through summer. So very artfully placed. Literally, my Kobo said I was 50% of the way through, and here it was happening. So I'm gonna let you tell us what is happening there and explain about mirroring that structure in the book.
For sure, yeah. So what Nathan's referring to is changeover, and that's all of the camps I'm familiar with have 2 sessions, the first session and the second session, and then with changeover in the middle. And so younger kids usually go for one or the other session. That's the part of camp they know. That's where their friends are. Yeah. A camper who's gone to first session for 6 or 7 years hears stories from second session but doesn't really know what it's like, and vice versa. The different sessions can have different textures or feelings. Campers who eventually, basically convince their parents to let them go the whole summer have a certain cachet.
Yeah.
And then eventually, when you become staff in your sit year, counselor in training, which is usually when you're 16, you have to stay the whole summer. And so so some campers will, you can graduate from only being there for 4 weeks to being there in the entire summer. And I definitely knew that's how I wanted to structure the novel. And so I think it came together really nicely. Also, those 2 major narratives that we've been talking about, the arrival of the Israeli soldiers and Brett's plan to buy the Crown land, those sort of map on to the 2 sections as well. And the second part of the novel, the second part of the novel opens with Tom, drinking his coffee in the early morning and thinking about changeover. So, these things are sort of brought to light, and Tom thinks about how first session is almost always bigger. There's more campers there. First session is sort of more, formal, structured. Second session is more loose. And I think that's a phenomenon we see everywhere in the world, where like the second half of something is usually a bit more messy or lived in or not as strict.
Yeah. I think camp feels for a lot of folks like something that brings about change. Kids go away one way, and they kind of come back a different way. Part of it's just time. A month in the life of a 10-year-old is a heck of a lot. And a lot of it's experience, because they've been away. As this thing we're describing is truly remarkable. With sending children to go live together with just adequate supervision, learning things about themselves. I think you're supposed to come back from camp a little bit different. And I wondered, is there a change maybe? Is there a way you kind of want a reader to come away from this novel maybe a little bit different?
Ruby says it herself more than once, I believe, that the fact that you can live these two different lives, your home life with your parents and school and the city, etc., where you have to, beg your mom for a lift to go to your friend's house, and then camp where you're all living together. The rules are completely different. It's much more communal. The fact that you can live those two separate lives as like a middle class or upper middle class Jewish teenager in Toronto means that different worlds are possible. Means that we have a say in how we build the society we live in. And I think that is one of the takeaways that I hope some readers come away with.
Aaron, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Nathan. It was great to talk to you.
I have been speaking with Aaron Kreuter, author of Lake Burntshore. Find it at Kobo and Conversation's home on the web. It's kobo.com/conversation. Check the show notes for a link. Follow us in your podcast player of choice to catch every episode. If you enjoyed this one, tell somebody who you would choose to bunk with through summer camp. Maybe not all the way through changeover. Maybe you pick somebody else for after changeover, but certainly like one of the halves. Share this with them. Kobo in Conversation is produced and also hosted this time around by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.